Hello and welcome today to the Xavier Teitelman studio, where we are going to talk about the future of the battle tank and the MGCS program. And for that, today, we are lucky to welcome two personalities. Patrick Ansel is a professor, notably at the School of Economic Warfare, where I've also lectured, and now heads the Artem consulting firm. And Thomas Seignon, who is a former cavalry officer, who is the former DGA land advisor, who also worked at the STAT, the technical section of the army, and also at the school of the...
What am I saying, the cavalry?
The cavalry school. We know about tanks there, that's pretty much it.
You could put it that way.
Let's put it that way. My first question, when we look at Ukraine, is the tank outdated? Is it useless now? Is it...
Personally, I just observed that today there are tanks everywhere, on every theater of operations. Of course, we were shown the images in 2022 of the arrival of the Soviets, well, the Russians, sorry, in Ukraine. With what we've all seen, those images of destroyed tanks in Brovary.
There are some very well-known images.
Everyone knows them. First, it's not just tanks being destroyed. Many troop transports and tracked vehicles are also hit. People call them tanks, but they're not. Second, just because equipment is used poorly doesn't mean it's not operational. And then, in this same kind of extraordinary, I would even say media-driven generalist approach, 2 years later, we're told that the arrival of European-made tanks for the Ukrainians, like the British Challenger 2 or the German Leopard 2, will be a real game-changer for the war, which is the same kind of exaggeration, but on the other side, it doesn't make sense. To conclude, the tank's death has been declared many times before, starting in 1917 during the first battles at Chemin des Dames. We failed with our 130 tanks that went out and only half of them came back. The command said, "Is this really effective?" And then, as an example, in 73, the Israelis took a real beating, if I may put it that way, losing in the space of a single day against the Egyptians. And with the first anti-tank missiles deployed, 250 to 300 tanks in a single day. If you will, the death of the tank, okay?
It's not the first time.
Let's try to go a little deeper on the subject and not stop at this view that I would say is a bit of a caricature.
Let's agree that tanks will always be needed in the future to advance and break through. You said something important, which was also that it's a matter of doctrine and use. The Russians haven't necessarily used them as they should have, especially against drones, and the Ukrainians haven't used them in the same way either. But how, if we look to the future, are we talking about the MGCS? How can we define a valid employment doctrine today that will be valid until 2080 for a tank that will come out in 20 years?
We're told that the MGCS is the successor to the Leclerc in France and the successor to the Leopard 2 in Germany. With this image, which I would call outdated, which refers to a tank as it is today as it was in the past, and for many people it's a reference to a kind of dinosaur belonging to the Cold War, and on top of that would be subject to, I would say, the myth of World War II battles. We're not there anymore. So, MGCS, Main Ground Combat System. The first word that comes up is system, and so a system, as its name suggests, is several elements that are combined together. The tank is one element of the system. We can consider it a strong link in the system, but it's only one element of the system. Do we want to put all the emerging technologies, which are not yet mastered but that we're planning, onto a single chassis? That seems difficult to me. That's more or less what has been done up until now. We keep adding, we load up these poor chassis that end up weighing absolutely impossible amounts. Today we're reaching weights of 70 tons, 80 tons. Where are we going then? You can clearly see it's a dead end. We can't go any further with this. So the thinking that's being done through MGCS seems interesting to me from a doctrinal point of view, to ask what the tank of the future will be. But the tank, let's forget the image of tanks from 1918. We're not talking about the Renault FT anymore, if you will.
So we're thinking about an ecosystem, not just the tank itself. It's a bit like when we talk about FCAS in the aviation field, with the sixth generation aircraft and its whole ecosystem.
We have sensors and effectors on one side and the challenge of data fusion on the other. And ultimately, MGCS is intended to be more like that rather than a specific platform within this ecosystem.
And that means we're adding some slightly futuristic sensors, we're imagining future radars.
And the goal is to get all these components to work together, whether they're on a specific platform or even outside the platform, by pooling resources. And the goal is to allow the fusion of all the data collected by these different intelligence and targeting tools and then generate effects that will be extremely versatile, meaning that we can, and that's the principle of cross-domain. Battlefield means that, in fact, we will be able to have an effect generated by effectors that don't necessarily exist today, but that will be available to tactical units which will be shared. If you look at the Uberization of what's being done with artillery in Ukraine, yes, well, the idea is to move toward that on a very large scale, a meta-Uberization for the benefit of ground combat.
But that means we're coming back to this ecosystem, we're coming back to this question of doctrine. Typically, we have to defend ourselves against drones and missiles. That's the case now. Yes?
That's the trend now, but 10 years ago, it was IEDs.
Yes, both are necessary then.
And artillery shells are extremely lethal on certain platforms, for example.
They are highly accurate. Artillery is now becoming more important due to its precise strikes. When I was a young lieutenant, artillery was just for leveling football fields. Now we're hitting with meter-level precision. We're clearly in an evolution, but technological advancements are just one part of the equation, if you will, the evolution through MGCS. I see three main players involved on what I call a mixing board. To give a fairly clear idea so that this mixing board makes sense, you have sliders. Some of these sliders depend on the military. Obviously, we're talking about defense equipment, so the military, through doctrine, through the doctrinal thinking that's carried out, expressing the need, what is the threat, how do we respond to it, etc. That's the purely, I would say, military domain. It's one of the players at this mixing board who raises or lowers certain sliders, depending on the needs and the threat. You have a second major player, which is obviously the DITB. The industrial and technological base will also adjust these sliders. Mastery of technologies, maturity of certain technologies, integration, industrial capacity to implement them, because that's important too. Between these two players, you have a key element, which is the DGA, the General Directorate for Armament, which acts as the interface between these two players. That already makes quite a few stakeholders. But there's a third one that comes in as a second tier but is very important, which is the politico-economic world. Do we want to go in a certain direction? What is the will to go in that direction? In the field of armament, we can clearly see today that this politico-economic action is extremely visible. Let's use an example from armored vehicles. Not tanks, but lighter ones. The company Arquus has just been taken over by a Belgian company called John Patrick Defense, but in which the French state is present, obviously. Why? To create a coherent whole. Starting from a company that specializes more in chassis, another more in turrets. We mount the turret on the chassis. We have a sensible approach to European defense, so we can clearly see that here we're gaining significant perspective. But these are, on the mixing board I mentioned, these are extremely important sliders. The only challenge, if I may say, is that unlike a DJ alone at a mixing board, here there are several people. And the planets need to align.
They don't have the same goals.
And that's what I was going to say, because there's still a difference between the military, who wants to be able to defend, attack, and protect his men. And then there's the question of cost. And here we're back to the issue of, the low-cost approach to war that we're seeing, mass and low cost. Is it compatible with a very high-tech army? In other words, if in 35 years we have 200 MGCS and on the other side the Russians have 2,000 tanks, with an acceptance of peace, a loss that is very high, will we be able to do it?
We will probably have an MGCS with components inside an MGCS. That's the general concept of this inter-system cooperation. On the mass side, it's clear that we can't just respond with technology if we don't have the reserves behind to absorb the shock. And we are facing opponents who will not be the asymmetric opponents of previous decades. We're seeing the return of conventional warfare. We're facing a potential opponent who is perfectly symmetrical, or even to gain an advantage tomorrow. With certain technologies, we have a significant challenge of scaling up, and we can't just hope for a technological miracle. To defeat the masses of effectors that could be sent against us, or the masses of troops that could be sent against us, we face the challenge of not ending up like the Spartans against the masses of Athens and its allies.
Does that mean that in the end, instead of having a tank that's capable of doing a little bit of everything, we would have modules that work together with each other? For example, maybe a tank or armored vehicle, or even a drone, a ground robot that would handle anti-drone defense, and then another one that would provide anti-air support, and then another one that would provide fire support.
We're getting into the idea of a system that we mentioned earlier. Indeed, will it be like that? In any case, in the end, it will always be a compromise. I return to my mixing board analogy. With several players, everything must align, so compromise is inevitable. The military, as you said, always wants the vehicle to do more and to do everything and so on. The manufacturer, on the other hand, says, that's nice, but it's not possible, because if you want it to do everything, it's going to come at a price. Absolutely not possible. So, in any case, it will be a compromise based on real political and economic will, because that's important. Otherwise, it won't lead to anything. For example, the Americans in the early 2000s developed a program called FCS, Future Combat System.
It was a system of systems.
It's a system of systems that cost billions and that they abandoned overnight, just like that, because the politicians said, stop, we're done, so, if you will. It's really the coordination of these different players that makes things complex, but it's the only way to achieve a system that responds as best as possible as a compromise to the various threats as we have them.
But aren't we aiming too high by trying to create a system that does too many things at once? And for it to really be a revolution, wouldn't it be better to work more incrementally by adding a sensor, etc.? That makes the vehicle heavier. But wouldn't it be better to have some intermediate steps, maybe like the Germans do, by the way, with the Leopard that they managed to supply to everyone before reaching that 2045 goal, and nothing between a Super Leclerc tank and the MGCS?
I think there's a contradiction in the MGCS. It's a core challenge to get systems, subsystems, sensors, and effectors to cooperate. Technology and operational demands are both driving us in that direction. Faced with drone swarms in particular, we have the challenge of being engaged in distributed combat, and on this point, France is a pioneer. The BOA dates back more than 30 years now. It was in the 1990s. The Scorpion Airland Operational Bubble is a program that is extremely advanced compared to most other powers. So we need to move towards that, and at the same time we see this as an opportunity to renew equipment, especially the tanks. In my view, these aren't the same issue, but we're grouping them together, maybe to justify not spending any money. We're investing a bit in the Leclerc, but not planning to renew it soon. That pushes us back to horizons that are far away. We're talking about 2035, 2040. These are two different subjects, except that if you remove the tank as the subject of renewal, it's hard to justify the budgets, especially from a political point of view, on something that is ultimately about digitization technology and cooperation between sensors and effectors. The core is there, it's data fusion, it's AI. Making that concrete for an elected official or a member of parliament voting on budgets is tough. It's delicate and challenging. How many divisions do I get with that? None.
What budget are we talking about?
At this point, we have no details. We only know what we're beginning to discuss. We don't have an overall budget.
Maybe $1 billion.
The budgets, they blow up anyway.
And the Army understood precisely with the BOA in the early 2000s, late 90s, that it was necessary to develop programs with overall coherence. Because, for example, when the Navy proposes a new aircraft carrier, they're not just referring to a new ship, but to more than just a new ship, plus the planes that go on it, plus the submarine that circles around it, so there's an overall coherence. And the sailors had an easy time saying, oh, well, yes, but if you remove the frigate, the thing doesn't hold up anymore. With Scorpion, that's what we did. So at the same time, there's a double approach. There is a process of doctrinal reflection that is necessary and that the armed forces carry out at regular intervals, but at the same time, to guard against the risk of having things taken away from us. Things that we used to present in small pieces, and now we say we have a comprehensive program. If you remove a piece, a link in the chain, it collapses. And so it's important that the Army can also move forward in this area to preserve, let's call a spade, preserve the funding. It's not necessarily about looking for things that are very, very complicated or super complex technologies. You know, when the Leclerc arrived, we had a bit of trouble. In the Armored Corps, that is, we were moving from a vehicle called the AMX-30, whose initial development was actually planned as a French-German project. I'll close the parenthesis because it was a failure. And so we ended up with a machine where the first thing you have to do when you get in is initialize it by typing on a keyboard. But I can tell you that there are people in the Armored Corps who didn't get past this step, even though they were completely professional in their field. On an AMX-30 who used to say engine running forward behind me, but now it was no longer engine running forward behind me. Now it's, I'm starting my tank and talking to an artificial voice from beneath the button.
How many years did it take to integrate the Leclerc between delivery and admission to active service?
Entry into service, 9 years.
9 years, 9 years.
But for entry into service?
In operational service, 9 years. If I recall, it was declared in 1999 during the Kosovo deployment. Knowing that the first vehicles arrived in 1990 to 1991 at Mourmelon at the 501st Battle Tank Regiment, and it was difficult for a lot of reasons.
But you see, you have a problem. It's that when Stefan Meyer, the CEO of Nexter, presents MGCS before the Defense Committee, in May 2019 he says MGCS, it's about renewing 8,000 tanks in Europe. He avoids discussing the system of systems or topics that are ultimately incomprehensible, at least to politicians. This isn't exactly a heroic cult. The defense issue concerns renewing combat tanks. While it may not be the start, it helps anchor this paradox. MGCS, so it's a tank? No, it's not a tank.
I'm coming back to the doctrine, to the uses, to the perspectives. We can see more or less that it's unclear. An ecosystem of armored vehicles is emerging, working together with all related elements alongside our strategic competitors. So already when we take stock of what we have and when we compare ourselves, we can see, for example, in Ukraine, even if it hasn't been the game changer, especially due to a lack of numbers, because giving 30 tanks didn't change much, but can we really be satisfied with the level of our tanks? If we compare with, for example, the T-90, where already, today, we wonder if we've made a mistake in what we've done up until now.
So we've made a mistake in what we've done up until now. No, we can't really say that. A vehicle like the Leclerc, if you will, even today, is a vehicle that, now being well mastered by the crews, because it took time, as I said, it's a vehicle that still provides capabilities that even more recent tanks still don't have.
If I may, the ambition of the Koreans with the K2 is to reach the level of the Leclerc from 30 years ago.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
3 people on board, that's it.
They're targeting operational capabilities we've had for 20 years with the Leclerc.
Moving it, that's the kind of thing there.
The same precision and effectiveness we've maintained for 20 years.
A shooting course Leclerc, I've done it, and I've done it before, with the AMX-30, if you will. A shooting course is carried out in a completely different way in an AMX-30. So you had a 105 mm cannon, a 20 mm coaxial weapon, and a 7.62 mm machine gun for the tank commander. And then a crew of 4 people, the driver below and 3 people who were in the turret area. And so, practically speaking, I can tell you we would take off our headsets and talk to each other by shouting. All of this with the smoke from the 20 mm cannon, which is very harmful, by the way. In short, after 30 minutes, you would reach the end of the course with the different stages. You would have fired about 10 105 mm rounds, around 50 20 mm rounds, and about 100 machine gun rounds, etc. You were tired, and when I say tired, I mean physically exhausted. And yet, the enemy in front of you, they're just cardboard targets. So I can imagine the situation with a guy who shoots back, because on top of that, the targets had the decency to talk, which was kind of nice. So if you want, we found ourselves with the Leclerc, with a machine that provides automatic loading, detection capability, and stabilized firing while moving day or night. It's just not comparable to the previous one. You're alone. You don't see or bump into others. If my loader in the AMX-30 doesn't load the 105 shell or set the safety, I send him one and hit him on the head so he'll do his job. There, it's the machine that does the job, and it's very smooth since the radio is triggered from the neck and ear. There's no button to press. You just have to speak and the message goes through. We're nearing the end. We hit the target almost every time thanks to the machine's efficiency. When everything works well and we arrive, we're much more relaxed than if we had done it with the AMX-30.
Let's be clear, everything you're describing here, the T90M isn't capable of that.
So from an ergonomic point of view, I haven't been inside the T90, but I'm not saying it's worse. That's not the point. First, the main value of a tank is the people inside it. Today, that hasn't changed, so it starts with that. It's very likely that it's capable of many things. But I would say it was designed as a successive improvement of an existing vehicle. In fact, it was the T-72. The Leclerc, we decided
To start from scratch?
blank slate, with initially immature technologies that we gradually developed. The Leclerc is powered by an engine that's basically just a V8, while vehicles like the Leopard 2 have a turbocharged V12. So what does that mean? Which means the vehicle is longer by 1 road wheel. When you look at them closely, there are 7 on a Leopard and 6 on a Leclerc, So the engine is more compact, which means the vehicle is more compact so you can add more armor for the same weight and so on. Ultimately, you have to consider many factors, making it a high-performance vehicle.
More complicated than it looks?
Yes, of course, but we had to get used to it. And you should never forget that when a machine comes into service, after a certain period of testing, the crews have to get used to it, and that takes time.
So the fact that the T-14 isn't deployed, there are two reasons. One is political. If you have destroyed T-14S, let me remind you, the T-14 is the Armata, the new Russian tank. And then there's probably the fact that its IOC hasn't been reached. It's the first new tank built from scratch, and as far as I know, the program was even cancelled.
The T-14 is typical of the Russians. I'd even say it's historical. The T-14 reminds me of the parade on Red Square in the 1930s. With the vehicles called T-28 and T-35 at the time, which were multi-turret tanks, it was very fashionable back then. Where a central turret is surrounded by smaller turrets, monstrous vehicles. They had to be huge with underpowered engines as they lacked the necessary power back then. They were very fragile and only suitable for parades on Red Square. In 1941, when deployed, they broke down before reaching the front lines. So the T-14 is typical of this kind of political and diplomatic showmanship. In fact,
it didn't even make it to the front before breaking down. It broke down right on Red Square.
And then this idea, we can discuss a lot of things. The idea of a crew locked inside the hull with an unmanned turret. You need to be very careful with these things. Why does the Jaguar, which just entered service, have 360-degree episcopes for the tank commander? There's a pretty simple reason. War isn't fought behind screens. War isn't an electronic game that you play. War is fought with real people. And in France, at least, we have this culture. I've seen it several times during operations. When we arrive in a village in Africa, we get out and go see the village chief. We don't just speed through honking the horn.
I said it.
They're known for that, that's it. So we look at what's happening around us, we talk, and this conversation, we don't do it through screens because the screen creates distance, inevitably.
So, nevertheless, with the MGCS, do we imagine having this distance? And do our counterparts, our competitors, think the same way?
I don't know what our competitors think, but that they're thinking about it, I think, is obvious. A country like China, which is developing militarily, must be giving very careful thought, in my opinion, to the future of ground engagement. I'm sure the Americans are considering it too. We Europeans, and that's partly what the MGCS represents, are reflecting on this at the European level. Doctrinally, it's true there's work to do. The German and French armies have very different cultures.
Yet they're still Europeans.
And yet they're still Europeans. But I think here too, we shouldn't cry before we're hurt. We have the right to hope that we'll achieve something.
We face a specific challenge, demographics. We are aging countries, and we have the fantasy of replacing manpower with technology. That's what we were saying earlier. But here we're talking about human numbers. So the idea of saying we're going to digitize everything, have effectors, have robotics, in the end, we're replacing boots with technology. But you pointed out the limits when facing a mass attack. We'll quickly run out of reserves.
But does the mass deployment of potential drones, drone technology and so on make up for it?
Ukrainian drones now number about 5 to 6 million annually.
Now 10,000 per day.
It's monstrous, isn't it? Even so, the Russians are retreating.
No, but maybe they're advancing less.
But they're advancing quickly, so you hit limits.
I'd also like to come back to the point you raised, which is cooperation, a European project. Why do we need the Germans and why do they need us?
As Thomas pointed out earlier, with the army, the defense industry, and the political world, from a political point of view, it's very good to have a cooperation program. It strengthens European cooperation on the highly sensitive issue of defense. So, there's this aspect where, well, we have a topic. The problem is, here again, we have an imbalance. I'll go back to this presentation, this hearing of the head of Nexter in 2019 before the Defense Committee. He tells the parliamentarians the European tank market is 8,000 tanks. The French-German share of this market is 43%. So, MGCS will take at least 43% of this market of 8,000 tanks. That's 4,000 tanks. That's 50 billion. The problem is that the French-German share is 43%. The German share is 40%.
That's not acceptable.
And 3% for France. We finally have an opportunity in 2012. MGCS, where does that come from? It's like Renault-Nissan. Nissan struggles, Renault seizes the opportunity. Krauss-Maffei in 2012 hardly exports at all. They just lost the Saudi contract. Not because of the client, but because environmentalists are blocking exports in Germany. And in the end, there are about 200 tanks in France, 200 tanks in Germany, and not many export prospects. It makes sense to cooperate. I'm naive. I believe Krauss-Maffei acted in good faith in 2012. And then, quickly, exports pick up again. The Leopard is a commercial juggernaut. You have the Leopard Club, where the community of countries that own the tank cooperate to develop, share R&D costs, and keep this tank system alive. Who took over the Leopard Club for Leopard 1? So, are there 2 Leopard Clubs now? Why involve the French when they have little impact on the international market? France has 400 tanks, 450 tanks in the world. Germany has 4,500, that's 10 times more.
The imbalance exists because the Germans sold their tanks after the Cold War. The Leclerc tank is half a generation ahead in terms of technology, but that was after the end of the USSR.
And there's a German choice that was made, which is extremely strategic. The Cold War is still there. The Leopard 2 orders were not cancelled. And they will build, well, 1,800 Leopard 2 tanks, even though they no longer have any operational need for these tanks, but they will serve as a Trojan horse for export. They will be cascaded, meaning transferred or sold to countries that have needs, as used equipment, second-hand equipment. That's the second life cycle today. No, back then already, it was all in the 90s. Okay, and in the end you have 2 countries that buy new tanks are the Netherlands and Germany, and almost all the others get these used tanks, but they keep them operational. They are modernized, we sell ammunition and maintenance, and the industry keeps its expertise. Plus, we have thousands of Leopards to use. The Germans face an industrial strategy issue.
What was I going to say? There's a famous saying, Germans discuss industry when discussing the defense industry, while the French focus on defense.
We swap one for the other.
Yes, but the problem is if the Germans no longer need us. Today, what are the chances that we'll actually see this program through to the end?
There is still more to MGCS than just tanks. And in terms of sensors, in optronics, France is very, very good at digitization. We still have a lead. There are many segments like smart munitions. With MBDA and company, we still have some advantages. And we say to ourselves, the Leclerc tank doesn't have a good image in the politico-diplomatic world in terms of exports. There's always been discomfort about Leclerc, because the first prototypes went into operation, went to the regiments without really being debugged. And so there's a kind of negative aura around the Leclerc tank. When it comes to exports, people have always doubted France's ability to export, just like they doubted the Rafale. Until about 10 years ago, no one believed in it anymore. Now, we couldn't produce the Leclerc for export. However, we don't preserve these technologies to make them an export tool. For the Germans, the Leopard 2 tank is a product designed for export, and that makes a big difference in positioning. So yes, the Germans see themselves as industrialists, as merchants. You're absolutely right. The French are considering cooperation because it's good politics, and we lack the critical mass to build a tank. We lack enough resources alone and must cooperate due to our ambition for European defense.
Recent rumors about restarting the Leclerc production line for India or Romania are just media noise meant to drive down competitors' prices.
We're selling technology, including some very interesting Leclerc components. There are several key markets, especially India. We have the ability to sell technological solutions.
Due to dissatisfaction with their T-90s, among other reasons. On the Indian side,
Yes, but if you will, with the Germans, the problem of the type of tank and Franco-German cooperation, unfortunately, this is not new. I was talking earlier about the MX-30. You should know that the MX-30 was born from a program called Europa Panzer in 1958-1959, which led to the AMX-30 on one side and the Leopard 1 on the other. But at the beginning, there was a real desire for it to be Europa Panzer. It didn't work out with the Leclerc, so we tried again a second time. The Germans had kindly agreed to let us call it the Napoleon. That would have made us happy, but, well, it didn't lead to anything for us either. I think I'll go back to my mixing board and the political and economic players behind it, because actually that's what it is at this level. We're dealing with the political and economic level. We're no longer talking about the quality of the machine as an operational vehicle. That's not even the issue. It's really about the weight we put on it in terms of intent. So maybe I'm a bit naive, but I still believe in political will. It didn't work the first time in the early 60s, and yet we really pushed things far, since we even did comparative tests. In France, at the Meilly camp, it didn't work in 90 with the Leclerc. For a lot of reasons, but fundamentally for political and economic reasons. I hope this time we might succeed. Otherwise, we could just do like the Poles and buy Korean tanks.
So, are you optimistic or pessimistic about 2035?
The fact that we're mixing up the tank and MGCS in the end makes the discussion a bit confusing. Either we accept that we won't make a purely French tank, in fact, will we even still have a tank as such? If we look at the distribution of MGCS technological components, the Germans have the chassis, and we're giving ourselves time to see whether the armament will be the 130 Rheinmetall or the 140 Ascalon Nexter. Well, KNDS France, we're giving ourselves time, but actually the Germans have already made up their minds. They have no intention of choosing the 140, so the door has been opened. Emmanuel Chiva said that we could imagine having a different weapon system, and that's not a problem with regard to what the MGCS system of systems is. We need partners. If we're the only ones with the 140 and it's not standard, it will be very difficult. And we're going to develop a technology on our own again, even though there's a real operational advantage to the 140. It's not just a tank gun, it's not just about having a bigger gun than our neighbor, it's that we're versatile. We can fire smart munitions, we can fire charges, we can fire drones, we can fire all sorts of things. With a 140, we can imagine. It's Marc Chassilon who says there needs to be a 30-degree angle on this future turret to be able to do indirect fire, to be able to fire smart munitions at very long range. We're dealing with something extremely versatile, much more capable than a 130mm cannon, which in that case is just a 120mm plus, it's an anti-tank cannon. I'm exaggerating on purpose. Here, we face a real challenge, and with technological constraints, the 140 must be pushed to its limit. With players who aren't German, maybe the Indians, maybe the Americans, maybe some Nordic countries, maybe others. I hope there are in-depth discussions on these topics, so we aren't overtaken by the 130.
To sum up, we'll be in the MGCS, but not necessarily in the tank, if the Germans keep moving forward.
The chassis is German. That already means that for export, if tomorrow you want to export a French tank, that is a version of the MGCS, with a 140mm gun, the Germans could block us. We need the Bundestag's vote.
That's encouraging, knowing that we had also linked the future of the FCAS to the MGCS and vice versa.
So it's legitimate that there should be sharing, but in France we tend to give assurances before the agreements are sealed. And that's a bit of the difficulty we have with Germany, which is still, in terms of economic power, a notch above.
And which is equipping itself to succeed industrially and completely outpace us now.
Yes, well, I'm an optimist by nature. That's just how I am.
I'm the naive one and you're the optimist?
Yes, that's it. I still see that today, German politics is evolving a lot when it comes to defense. Things we couldn't have imagined even just 2 years ago are happening now. So, well, let's try to see the bottle or the glass as half full. And let's hope that now, I don't know what will happen in 5 years, 10 years, I don't know what will happen. Not only in terms of political and economic relations, etc., but I don't know what will happen in a year. If someone had told me in '90 that a year later we would be going to the Gulf with a tank regiment, I would have had a hard time believing it. Why, how, what is it about? And yet, that's what we did.
Or that by 2021 we could face Russia before the decade ends?
That's it. But here the problem is that the confrontation with Russia, for now, remains, I was going to say, in a theoretical way. There in the Gulf, we didn't go theoretically, we left concretely. Well, let's try to be able to project ourselves to 2040, certainly, but let's also try to be able to project ourselves to 2027.
But you have the German political discourse, you have the industrial discourse, you saw the DST we did with the CR 451 Research Center of L about German culture, industrial culture. It's in their DNA. Germans have very territorial ecosystems. Why lose a German partner who for decades has been our supplier, subcontractor, whose R&D I finance, in favor of a French company that brings me a market of 200 tanks when my own market is larger? So we estimated that the German tank market is 2,000 tanks over 15 years, and actually that's what we don't see. What France has trouble accepting is that the Germans will dry up the tank market by 2040 when the MGCS could potentially enter service, and that the tank market in Europe, and possibly partly internationally, will be Leopard 2AX or the A8 already, the AX. The market will be dry and so we have no prospects. Export, so the 8,000 tanks of which we will take 43% market share. I'm sorry, that doesn't exist.
That's cheerful. Patrick, Thomas, thank you very much. We will share the links to the various studies you have done, your LinkedIn profiles, etc. Then, hoping that things move in the right direction, let's meet again in 2 years. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon at the Air and Cosmos studio.